Hello, everyone. It's lovely to see so many people joining us for today's presentation. Just going to let you know that we are leaving the chat open until Saeed's workshop starts, and then I'll just close it during that time. But yes, welcome, welcome, welcome. It is 12 p.m. Eastern here. Please share where you're tuning in from. It'd be lovely to see. Welcome to the November Fold Academy webinar. This month, we'll be talking about how to write a short story with Saeed Tibi. And before we start, a few housekeeping items. So this workshop is approximately 60 minutes, which does include a 15 to 20-minute Q&A at the very end. So if you have any questions during the presentation and even during the Q&A, please be sure to drop it into the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We are using Zoom captionings. Zoom's auto captioning function. So just to note that some of the caption may not be transcribed correctly. However, all of the captions will be corrected when the recording is made available on YouTube after the event. And yeah, that's pretty much it. I'm delighted to introduce our workshop facilitator for today, Saeed Tibi. Saeed Tibi is a writer and lawyer based in Toronto. His debut collection of short stories, Her First Palestinian, was a finalist for several awards, including the Atwood Gibson Writers Trust Prize and the Danuta Gleed Literary Award. The title story was shortlisted for the CBC Short Story Award. And I'm so excited to actually welcome Saeed Tibi to the workshop.
Thanks so much, Ardo. I'm delighted to be here. Hi, everybody. I see a bunch of people are exchanging highs and hellos in the chats. It makes me feel like this is a nice little community, and I hope and I'm glad as well to be able to contribute to it. Let me start by doing something which is going to be the most difficult thing I do today, which is try to share my screen. See where we get there. Can everybody see everything okay? I take it by the widespread assent that everything is okay. So today we're going to be talking about structuring the short story. And it's a matter that is near and dear to my heart. I'm at core a short story writer. I've dabbled in other forms, but the short story is the thing that I fell in love with. And structuring it is particularly important for reasons that we're going to explore soon. But I really don't think that I want to be very prescriptive in terms of how you should structure your short stories. In fact, just the opposite. We're going to try as much as possible to relate how we treat the form of the short story to the function that we're trying to get out of the short story. I'm going to go through some examples of what I mean by that. The way I'm going to do it is primarily I'm going to look at a very classic structure and then look at deviations from that structure. I think the end result that I'm hoping to get is not telling you that you should write in a particular way, but really to create some kind of framework to recognize what you're writing and what a good structure might be for that which you are writing. And to do that, I'm going to use, a lot of my stories. I don't know if you're if all of you are Cheever people, or if you're Alice Munro people, if there are any left in that category. But you're here and you might know me, so I'm going to use my stories. I'm going to use other stories as well. And at the end of this 10-hour tutorial, we'll take questions. The subject is wide and deep. Obviously, we're just going to be touching on the main things, but we'll see where we can get. And I look forward as well, obviously, to any questions you might have. Okay, so typically when people consider what the elements of a story are, they think about things like characterization. You got to characterize your main actors in the story. Think about where the story is, what the setting is, point of view, plot, theme, etc. Those are the main sort of canonical things. Structure is not typically considered part of it. Some people think of structure as part of plot. I don't really think of it that way. It could be. But as a gating question, I want to think about why structure is important. And to answer why structure is important, I want to ask another question first, which is the most obnoxious thing to do when you're trying to answer a question. And the question is a very elemental one, and that is, why do we tell stories? And I don't think there's a unified way to answer that. For each of you, the answer might be quite different, and it should be quite different. I can tell you some of the reasons I write stories. First and foremost, it's probably to entertain. Sometimes it's to understand. Sometimes it's to show. There's a phenomenon that I think is going on that people might not understand, and I want to show it. A lot of times, writers write to interrogate, um, to surprise. I think for most writers, there is an element of emotional connection that they're trying to get, whether with their characters or even with their readers. And so there can be a number of different reasons for telling a story, but being cognizant of your particular reasons will help you reveal to yourself, first and foremost, what the right structure is. And understanding the structure is important primarily to you as a writer, because structure is not something that most readers who are not writers are thinking about. The structure happens and the story acts on them as a result of the structure. But for you as a writer, it's important to be cognizant of what structure you're employing to what purpose. Um, and I would say that particularly for short stories, structure is important. For all narrative, structure enables the other elements. So if you do characterization, for example, at the very end of the story, for most narratives, it's not going to be super helpful because a whole bunch of stuff happened before and you haven't created a character connection with your readers. But a more loosey-goosey type of structure, I would say, can work better in longer narratives, something like a novel. In shorter narratives, like a short story, structure takes on um, a particularly outsized impact because there is such a short span in which you have to accomplish things. The order in which you do things, how you do them, will have a huge kind of impact on how effective your story is. Um, and for me, as I mentioned before, it's the key to unlocking the emotional impact of the stories. You can tell a story in two different ways. In one way, it will fall flat. In another way, it will be, some of the most momentous feelings you've had. Um, Hemingway has a very commonly attributed quote where he says prose is architecture, not interior decoration. And it's part of a sort of a big sort of diatribe he went on as on what exactly writing means or how it should be executed. But I want to think about this concept of prose as architecture, meaning that it's not just some freewheeling thing. It could be, but it's generally not in order to get the impact that you want to do. There has to be some features underlying it. The features might be hidden, but they're important. Um, and there's many different types of short stories. So for example, you could have a slice of life short story. You could have a vignette short story. I'm not going to talk about each different type. I'm going to talk about primarily one particular type and deviations from it. And the reason for that is because obviously it would take too long to talk about everything. But because again, the most common narratives are the ones that we're going to be talking about, and that's the three-act structure. Before I go into that, I want to be clear that as far as any narrative is concerned, the best part of it is the experimental part. The best part is where you're doing experiments as you're writing and seeing if that works, rather than following certain rules. What I hope to create is a sort of cognizance about what you're doing and why you're doing it, more so than anything else. Okay, so let's talk about the three-act structure first. going to start off with a diagram because I happen to be a very visual person. And it's probably a diagram you've seen before if you've attempted writing before. So I won't belabor it. There's three main acts in it. The first act is the setup. The second act is where you're sort of raising the stakes once you've had the setup. Some people call it the confrontation in the sense of a character being confronted by certain challenges that peaks in a climax to the story, and that's the highest point of tension, and then ends in a resolution where you have some new understanding of your character or something in the story, and the tension is relieved. You know, the past science students in me always wants to disambiguate that, you know, in a diagram like this, the x-axis is going to be time, and the y-axis is the sort of emotional charge in the story. So it starts off from a very low point, you know, low stakes where you're introducing the characters, and then it slowly builds up to a climax and then relieves. So that's your three-act structure format. Let's take a little bit of a closer look on what that looks like. Again, so we said the act one is the setup. That's where you establish the world of your story. What is included in the world? A lot of the elements that we talked about, especially the most important elements. So who the characters are. Who's your main character? Who are the supporting characters? Who's going to be important to the story? It establishes where the setting of the story is. It could establish the tone of the story. Typically, all that happens in the setup in the first act. And the reason you do that is because you want to establish what is normal for that story. Because presumably the rest of the story in a three-act structure is going to be a deviation from the norm. It's going to be stretching or challenging the normal. And so as part of it, what happens is that there's something called an inciting incident. Once you've established what the normal is, going back, you've introduced the characters, setting mood, and then there's an inciting incident. You see that represented in the blue. And that's an event that sets the story on its path. So for example, if my story is about reconnecting with a relative, and the way that happened is because I fell on the ground and almost died and ended up in the hospital. The relative heard about it, came to visit me in the hospital. Well, then the inciting incident is the falling on the ground and ending up in the hospital, because that sets in motion what happens in the rest of the story. It starts the story forward. Here's an example from one of my stories, Her First Palestinian. You see the very first paragraph contains a lot of the setup of the story. I'll be reading all of them, and here it is. It starts off, not long after the first joys of finding each other had settled, Nadia asked me if I would teach her about my country. It was inevitable. The walls of my Toronto apartment were conspicuously covered with Palestinian artifacts, and donation brochures featuring Gazan children were often lying around. And so you get a sense of who's in the story. You get a sense of a speaker, a narrator, and you get a sense of Nadia, who is his love interest. And you also get a sense of what might the story be about. That this person is teaching his girlfriend about his country. And you get a sense of setting. It's set in Toronto, particularly in his apartment. So there's a lot of very important elements that are right away in the very first paragraph. And those are the elements that are going to be used in the rest of the story. Not long after the setup, I get right to the inciting incident, right? So this woman that he's met and has started a relationship with is now being given all this information about Palestine, this person's country. And so he says, Nadia took to the cause immediately. She had a lot of outrage. So when she's given this information, she now became outraged, and she starts asking him questions. Do you realize that you're an indigenous population? I did. Do you realize that they're trying to prevent you from engaging in even the most peaceful forms of protest? I did. So now the story is well on its way. We've got a setup and we've got an incident where he teaches her and then she has a clear reaction to it. And now we can go upwards in terms of the tension in the story, in terms of raising the stakes. So we're finished with part one, which is the setup and the inciting incident. Now we can go to part two. What's part two? Well, part two is the confrontation or the rising action. That's where you're challenging your characters and you're raising the stakes on them. And typically that takes the form of something that increases their level of engagement in their life, their level of emotional problem or conflict or challenge that they're feeling. And you essentially keep raising those stakes. So in the same story, her first Palestinian, a bit later on, it says, over the next few weeks, I sent Nadia articles that I thought would interest her, a news story about another incident at a checkpoint, or a breakdown of the peace plan of the day. She sent back massive polemics, decrying the actions of the occupying military, wondering how a child so young could end up eyeless or armless from the volleys of grown soldiers. My inbox filled with Nadia's responses. So you can see already this is still very early on in the story, but already there's a sense of tensions rising, right? At the beginning, he was simply teaching her about his country. Now she's taking it up and taking it to a different level. She's looking up things about his country. She's trying to understand more and she's getting more upset. She's the one who's sending him articles. Whenever I saw her next, she would expand on her points and add more that she had thought of in the intervening time. I could not have been prouder. I felt like someone unexpectedly had understood a hidden part of me. Okay? That's the second part. That's the rising action. And once you've done that, you can add additional things. What could possibly make this tense time even tenser in order to progress your story? Okay. Once you reach to a point of great tenseness or great emotional charge, such that there is some kind of realization, that's when you're reaching the climax of your story. The climax is, again, the point of highest tension. Once you've hit the climax, hopefully there's some kind of reversal. Hopefully there's some kind of understanding, some kind of change, perhaps, that the character undergoes. And then you have a resolution. You sort of the payoff of the story. What is the understanding? What is the resolution? How do you reconcile what's happened? Okay. So that's your classic three-act structure. Nothing particularly controversial. You probably already know about it. You've understood it from other places. Again, this is what it looks like. Now, should you deviate from classic structure? Because it seems almost too easy to write a story like that. It's actually not. It's very difficult to execute a classic three-act structure very well. But to answer the question of whether you should deviate from a classic structure like that, I think at first you have to recognize that, as Matthew Salesses put it, a craft is a set of expectations. The way we're crafting something, the way we're writing, is because we have expectations of our writing. The expectations can be cultural, can be as a result of the literary history that we have, can be usually as a result of our reading background, right? What our society has read, what we've been taught in school. We expect a story to sound a certain way or to look a certain way. And so our expectations are actually the classic structure. You know, we think of a story having a beginning, a middle, and an end. Why don't we think of it as tell me the end always first, and then go back and tell me the beginning and the middle? That's not our classic structure. That's certainly a structure we've seen, but it's always a deviation from the classic structure. And that's because we expect it to be A, B, C. And the more we read, the more we crave that classic structure, I would say. all you have to do is watch a movie, like especially like one of those Hollywood like blockbuster movie, then see how your expectations are pretty closely aligned to what happens in the movie. So if you're expecting, the hero to find to start off in a bad place and then undergo some challenges and they grow in strength and eventually they vanquish someone, that's your expectations. And you see it and you actually like it if it's well executed on screen. Now you can agree or disagree with those expectations, whether they're good or bad, in quotes. But the salient feature typically of them is that they're entrenched, right? We have them whether we like them or not. And structure is a big part of those expectations. And so to the extent that you want to deviate from that structure, it's a straying from the expectations and you're making some kind of statement about why those expectations are not perfect for what you want to do with your story. So deviation can work, but it has to be intentional to understand why you're doing something different. My rule of thumb is that unless you have an excellent reason to deviate, then you should tell the story in the simplest, most straightforward way. And that's because telling a story in a simple, straightforward way is usually hard. And it's hard to execute properly and it's hard to perfect. And deviating from it, it makes it even harder. And so I would say that you should always ask yourself, what would I gain by telling this story in a different way? Would I become a better storyteller? Is my story being told in a more effective way, or am I just trying to be different? Am I trying to cover up that I don't really have much of a story and instead of story, I'm doing a lot of stylistic things? That's okay to write for style's sake. That's totally okay as long as that's your intention. But if you're trying to cover up not having a story or not having a good enough story or not a story that you want, then I'm not sure that that's such a great reason. Am I being more effective as a storyteller or am I being just bored and I'm doing things for fun? Again, it's okay to do things for fun, but it's not putting the story first, which I think is important. And so my reasoning when I ask you these questions is not to stifle originality, quite the contrary. I love originality. I think originality is a primordial value in any kind of art. But rather, it's to instill a sense of intentionality in what you're doing, particularly when it comes to structure. This is usually the point at which I ask if there's any questions, but there's not going to be any questions until the end. So one sec. Okay, so let's look at small deviations from classic structure first. And I typically like to use poems when I talk about stories to an audience that hasn't had prescribed reading before, and I couldn't assign you any readings. And I like to talk about poems because they're simply short, and many poems have a very narrative structure, narrative underpinning, and they're helpful that way. Here's one, which you may have seen. It's called If I Must Die by Rifat El Arair. I'm going to read it and then we're going to analyze what happened in it. Here goes. If I must die. If I must die, you must live to tell my story, to sell my things, to buy a piece of cloth and some strings, make it white with a long tail, so that a child somewhere in Gaza, while looking heaven in the eye, awaiting his dad, who left in a blaze, and bid no one farewell, not even his flesh, not even to himself, sees the kite you made, my kite you made, flying up above, and thinks for a moment an angel is there, bringing back love. If I must die, let it bring hope, let it be a tale. So I think at first glance, this is a very simple poem. And I think it is a simple poem, but it's not, and it has a story within it. So for sure, there is some kind of narration. But it's not as simple as it might seem structurally, because the writer, El Arair, is doing some interesting things. So let's analyze it. So if I must die, you must live. Those are the first words. And importantly to consider there's a speaker. The speaker is an I. And that's a really effective way to start a story because it brings engagement. The first person is always, a quite engaging way to tell a story. And what's happening, what the speaker's talking about is death, is his own death right away, or their own death right away. So they say, if I must die, then you must live. Very striking way to do it. But what's interesting is the next lines are not about the speaker at all, right? If I must die, you must live to tell my story, to sell my things. So somebody else has to tell the story. Somebody else has to sell the things, to buy a piece of cloth. Now you're dead. None of this is really affecting you as a speaker. To buy a piece of cloth and some strings, to make it white with a long tail, so that a child somewhere in Gaza, while looking heaven in the eye, all this is happening so that a child. So the main character here is the child. Right? So what we see is actually after the initial engagement with if I must die, there's now this whole bit of setup of things that are happening in a child's life, right? What is this child doing? He's awaiting his dad who left in a blaze and bid no one farewell, not even to his flesh, not even to himself. Okay. So this child is now we have a better picture of their life. This is an orphan who has undergone a traumatic incident, who is now being gifted something that was, yes, purchased using the speaker's money that was obtained by selling their things. But it's about the child, right? And the child is thinking of his dad, who is dead. And so what we see is once the setup happened, now we have a raising of the stakes. Now we know more about the child. The dad left in a blaze, bid no one farewell, not even to his flesh. It's a horrible way to think about it, but we think about what's happening to this child, what the child might be experiencing in terms of thinking about their parent there, right? Until a moment that reaches a high emotional point, bid no one farewell, not even to his flesh, not even to himself, sees the kite that you made flying up above. Finally, we get to the highest point of emotion in the story, the climax, and thinks for a moment that an angel is there bringing back love. So here, what's happening, whereas you would have the setup first usually, what's happening actually is the inciting incident, the thing that puts everything in motion is happening first. And that's because the speaker is not actually the point of the story. The child is the point of the story. In fact, the point of the story is probably to meld the speaker and the child, given the thematic things that are going on in the story. The idea that the story of the speaker becomes part of the story of the child, right? Everything else is still in the same order, but the inciting incident is no longer sort of at the end of the setup, is now right at the beginning. And that helps the function of the story. The form is following the function, and then we get back to the end with sort of a frame type of architecture. We're going back to the concept of if I must die. If I must die, let it bring hope, let it be a tale. So the child story, now fortified with the story of the narrator, becomes a new story. And it brings hope. Let it be a tale, let it be a story. So a slight deviation, but an important deviation. Think of how this story would have happened if the inciting incident was not first. We'd suddenly be talking about the child, we would be talking about the child first, which is fine, but then suddenly the speaker would insert himself. I would argue likely less effective. So again, the form is following the function and is serving the function in this story. Okay. What about if we want to do it a different way? What about if we want to put the beginning of the story at the end of the story? Why might that be advantageous? Well, it takes for one thing, like I mean, let's do an example. Actually, it shouldn't say beginning at the end at the beginning. Why would you put the end of the story at the beginning? Let me give you an example. Let's say, and you've read books like this, you've read stories like this, you've seen movies like this. It starts with somebody getting shot, right? You don't know anything about the shooter. You don't know anything about the person who was shot. Let's say it's a woman shooting a man, and that's the end. And right after that, the story starts talking about the events that led up to it. Well, on a surface level, you're like, well, anybody shooting anyone is not a good idea, is not a good thing. Maybe the story will adjust your view of that, right? So it takes the focus of the end and onto the journey. So you're not worried about what's going to happen at the end. You're now concerned about what's happening on the journey. So that's an effective way to do it by putting the end at the beginning. It adds a sense of intrigue, even though you know what's going to happen. You want to know how you got there. And it gives you a change in the perspective of the story. Okay. Here's an example. This is by Ghassan Kanafani. It's a story called Letter from Gaza. This is how it starts. It's a letter form of story. Dear Mustafa, I have now received your letter in which you tell me that you've done everything necessary to enable me to stay with you in Sacramento. I've also received news that I have been accepted in the Department of Civil Engineering in the University of California. I must thank you for everything, my friend. But it'll strike you as rather odd when I proclaim this news to you, and make no doubt about it. I feel no hesitation at all. In fact, I am pretty well positive that I have never seen things so clearly as I do now. No, my friend, I have changed my mind. I won't follow you to the land where there is greenery, water, and lovely faces, as you wrote. No, I'll stay here and I won't ever leave. Well, the rest of the story is actually just the story of why this person came to this conclusion. So we have the conclusion at the beginning, right? And it's intriguing because you would think that Gaza is a place that people would want to leave, right? You might want to leave Gaza. Even back when this story was written, which was in 1956, it was not a a safe place for people, right? But this person is telling you, I'm not going to leave. Now you know the ending. Now you as a reader can understand the journey better, can focus on the journey better, and can see how his mind changed because he's clearly thought about leaving. He's done things to end up in Sacramento. He's done things to end up with a position there, but he's opted not to do that. The story reveals why he came to that decision. Okay. Oh, wow. I'm being told that I have 5 minutes. So we're going to go very quickly. So this is the classic three-act structure. This is what that story does. It gives you the resolution first, and then it goes to the setup, confrontation, and the climax. But you already knew the resolution. Okay. What about if the beginning is in the middle? This is one of my stories. I'll read it very quickly, the beginning. What you have to do is silence the world. You have to tell the world to quit wailing, to calm itself, to let you think. Just as important, you have to pick one world and listen only to that world's wailing. That world's scream means nothing else. I mean, you can tell just from the fact that this is the beginning of a story that you're not anywhere at the beginning, right? You're not at the actual narrative beginning of the story because it gets into it very abruptly, as if you're already in conversation with the narrator who's telling you what you have to do is silence the world. It's like in the middle of a conversation, right? Where does it work to begin in the middle? Right? It works when you're trying to get some sense of mystery in the story. If you're trying to import a certain mood, the mood is going to be part of the thing. And in fact, that's what I'm doing in this story, right? The feeling of desperation, the feeling of wanting to be away from something, to silence something, right? That's helpful. And I wanted that mood to be central to the story, so I put it right at the beginning. It's also helpful when context isn't important. If you're setting something in the middle of World War II, for example, right? In a big historical thing, you don't have to give a ton of context. People generally know, so you can start things in the middle. You can say, hey, we were with the troops in such and such place. and people sort of already have an imported sense of what's going on. Okay, so that's the reason for why you might want to start in the middle. Um, I had wanted to talk about beginnings, and maybe I'll spend 1 minute on that. Beginnings, in my view, are very important. They're the most valuable real estate in your story because um, eh, people will always read the beginning. They might not read the rest of the story, but they will always read the beginning. So it's key to your structure, particularly as a starting writer, and I do it all the time. I try to establish a bunch of things right away. I always establish the characters, always establish the setting, and to the extent I can, the mood. When you're generous about those things, that's how you create engagement with your readers. If you do hide critical things, people think that that creates mystery. That doesn't create mystery. Quite the opposite. That creates frustration and creates a disinterest. But when you give them the critical things and enable them to connect with the story, um, that's very helpful and creates engagement. And so when you're thinking about structuring your story, I often think about what's the best point in the story to create that connection, and I start there. And obviously, you can hint at where you're going thematically, and you can always hide plot. Plot is among the least important elements in my view. You can always hide that if you feel that gives you a sense of mystery. Anyway, I may have had a couple of more things to say, but I think this is a good point at which to stop. If there's anything again that I wish to impart is that you can change things around in a story. Things are movable. You can even omit certain things as long as you know why you're doing it and recognize that you're doing it so that you're effective in doing it. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Saeed. I just want to start off by saying we got a lot of people. I'm just going to stop share screen for there. I got a lot of people writing in the Q&A box. I will open the chat for everyone, no worries. The chat's now open, but a lot of people were they loved the workshop, especially one person noted that it's really great to see you use your own work as examples. They found that particularly meaningful. So we have a ton of questions. I will start with the question I found fascinating because a lot of people had questions about this during the presentation, which is the use of the poem to talk about this narrative structure. A lot of people were like, but this is a poem, not a story or prose, so it has its own rules as a form. No? So that's the big question people have is poetry is a different type of practice. And so how can the rules still apply?
Right. Well, I think it depends on the lens in which you look at something through, right? Like I'm not a poet. I can look at a piece of writing and recognize that it's a poem, but also recognize within it very clear storytelling narrative elements. And ultimately, it's a piece of writing that is short and it tells a story. So for me, it's good enough for it to count as a story. And as I mentioned, in my I've done some measure of teaching. I have frequently used poems as stories. Yes, there are other elements that if a poet encountered that same poem that I put up, they might have different views of it. They might focus on the enjambments, or they might focus on the rhythm. I'm not focused on that. I'm focused on the story that is being told, and I think it's particularly helpful when you can see it so easily, all the various segments of the story in it, and you see it in just a one-page type of story. Could have just as easily chosen a work of flash fiction, but I like that poem.
We have so many great questions, so I'm trying to figure out where to where to start. So I'll start with because you mentioned there's like other structures. You focus on the three-act structure and its reversal, and like playing with that general structure. We've had people actually ask questions such as, "Can you talk about non-Western structures like, okay, Kishoten Ketsu?" As an example, and then someone else also wanted to know your comments about this particular short story structure being classical, yes, but is it also colonial as a result?
Yeah, I mean, I cannot speak about other short story structures or other narrative structures, at least with not with the same confidence. And the reason is I was raised on this form of short story structure. Are there others? 100%. Is it a comment on which is better, that I'm using the Western one? It's not. It's a comment on my audience, and my audience is typically coached, and their expectations, as I was mentioned, is a Western type of story. But certainly, I mean, I have some background in Arabic writing as well. There are extremely differing structures for Arabic writing, particularly like the sort of story within a story within a story within a story structure. You don't see that in English writing virtually at all, and most people would consider it confusing or alienating. Um, I like it. I've not practiced it, but it's possible that the you could have people teach you that as the classic form of the story. I'm dealing with the expectations in front of me.
I will say someone did recommend Henry Lien for the Kishoten Ketsu. So I'm just
Great.
going to throw that in the chat. But it's really great to crowdsource these answers. Um, so that kind of leads me to the next question, which is you already brought up Matthew Salesses, who did writing Craft in the Real World, which I highly recommend people check out. But he talks about expectations, and like you've explained, the reason why you chose a Western structure is because there's like an expectations in the West that we're, for the most part, currently operating out of. And so someone did ask if you had other recommendations on craft and structure that could be further reading for people who may want to explore. I think in Matthew's book, he does kind of talk about, I think like Japanese structure and storytelling as an example, if I remember correct. But
Yeah, I, I,
yeah.
I would recommend, and sorry to interrupt, I would recommend as an entry point to go to Sales's book, Craft in the Real World. He does have some bibliography there of other books you might want to consult. I am in many ways a poor person to ask this question because I am a lawyer. My formal training is not in writing short stories. It's stuff that I picked up and stuff that I do as an avocation, something I love, and I read sort of here and there, but not in any systematic way. So I wouldn't venture to say that this is the definitive place that you should start. I have read Matthew's book, and it's a great book. I've read a couple of others. I wouldn't recommend it for this particular. I'd recommend them for this particular questioner.
Yeah, and for the people watching the recording, start with that book. For people watching live, you get the benefit of the chat. They're very active and they're offering great resources for further reading, so check that out as well. So I have questions regarding one question asks, once you complete a story, is it okay to revisit the same ideas once again and tell it another way? To be more specific, if one writes and then publishes a short story, can they then take the idea and expand this into a novel or other works? Or should one move to another idea? What are the rules?
Yeah, I mean, there's no rules at all. And I look, if you're I think there's a school of thought that each artist really has one story, right? They have one theme, and all their work is a sort of a variation on that one theme, or even a revisiting of that one theme. And you'll see this over and over in the greatest artists and writers who spend a whole lifetime doing one thing in different ways, or even in very similar ways. There's no should follow what pulls you. Certainly, I thought while I was writing my book, with every new story, I was like, okay, I'm going to do something completely different. This time, it's going to be like just a totally different departure for me. And I thought I succeeded. But then when I have a remove from the book writing process, I look at them, I'm like, well, they're very much unified by X, Y, and Z. And those are, I guess, my themes, at least for that book. So sometimes even if you don't tr do that, you're going to end up doing that. So don't be afraid of doing that.
Excellent. So someone asked, can you talk more about what stakes mean?
Stakes, yeah, sure. So stakes is the sort of feeling that you're invested in a story because there is something at stake because there's something that you feel could change, and that would change your feeling about a particular character or how the character might react or move on in their life. So, for example, if you started out with a simple character walking, having a walk on a nice day. Raising the stakes might be they happen to bump into their ex-lover on this walk. Now you're at a point of higher emotional tension. There's greater stakes in the story in the sense that now the story is moving in a certain direction. You don't know what might happen, but you're more invested, more intrigued.
So stakes don't necessarily literally have to be like a plot thing in terms
No,
of,
no,
you
they
know,
don't
like
have
an
to be
action
about.
movie where more and more explosions
No,
happens.
no, no.
It can also just be emotionally raising the
It
stakes.
usually is emotionally raising the stake. I mean, the explosions will raise your emotions too, but
That's true.
it's just the most vulgar way of raising the stakes.
So I have two questions that are pretty similar. They're asking, so they find it difficult. One person finds it difficult writing long form while slimming close in all of the material to discern whether ordering is like they're trying to figure out how do you figure out between one type of ordering in terms of structure versus another and being able to discern that. Has it been for you trial and error, experience maturity, close reading, that kind of thing? Where someone else asks, can you give an example from your own work when you've actually moved structure around to make it more effective?
Yeah, so I mean that's a very good question, and that was something that if this presentation had gone on an extra 10 minutes, I would have gotten to a slide where I talk about this. Um, I don't think it's helpful, or at least it hasn't been helpful for me to think of structure before I think of everything else in the story. So I tend to have an idea of what I'm about to do, start writing a lot, and then there at a certain point in the story, I now sit down and think, okay, what's this story missing? Have I characterized this person enough now that I'm using them so much in the story? Are my readers going to be invested in this person? Um, have I got the mood right? Have I got the tone right throughout the story? And have I got the structure right? Is this the best way to tell the story, or is there a different way? And of course, it's happened before that I start off with a different structure and end up thinking this is exactly the wrong way to do it. And you know, fine-tuned or sometimes did wholesale alterations to the story. That's totally okay. I don't think structure is something that you set out to do, but its structure, as I mentioned, is something you should recognize in order to know A, whether you're doing it and that's what you want to do, and B, why you're deviating from it and whether it makes sense to do that.
Yeah, it kind of sounds like back to like the architecture analogy, the idea of like you plotting something out initially, right? And you do that first draft, but it's not until you get to the building of it, which is in the editing process, that you're like, oh, okay, yeah, we got to reinforce this, we got to do that. And I think that's where a lot of like the editing aspects of it will really hone in on the structure of it, because you can't really edit a blank page. You got to just start
Exactly
writing.
right. Yeah.
Excellent. Someone asked, do you have any favorite linked short story collections to recommend as a way to study this form?
Linked short story collections? No, I don't like, it's not that I don't like linked short story collections. I don't find extra value in linked short story collections. I look at each story as its own thing, and I love that about short stories. I think linking short stories is a generally a more new thing designed to create a sense of, oh, hey, this is a one cohesive book. But in terms of short story collections that I love, there are so many. From the presentation, there's one called Men in the Sun by Ghassan Kanafani, which includes the story that I mentioned. I've always loved Jhumpa Lahiri's Interpreter of Maladies. That's an excellent one. There's so many. So yeah, those are the ones that come to mind right now. I think there's a recent one that I really quite enjoyed as well, but I forgot which one.
There's also How to Pronounce Knife by Suvankam
Oh,
Thamavangsa,
that's a good one. Yeah,
which was really good. Also, uh, Taya Mutanji's Shut Up, You're Pretty,
that's a
or Shut
great
Up,
one.
I'm
Yeah,
Pretty.
yeah,
One of
I
those
quite
two.
like that one. That one was on Canada Reads last year.
Yes, yes, yes. Someone asked, can you please shed some light on if at all, the structure changes if it's a multi-view POV story or has dual timelines told in parallel? Do they have to be at the same point in the structure at every point? I don't know. Do we normally have multi-POV stories in short stories?
I mean, you could. I've seen short stories like that. So I think the answer is no, they don't have to be anything. Nothing has to be anything. But there's always drawbacks to making things more complicated. And the drawbacks are typically comprehension, typically people following or being alienated. And so you have to really be very discerning and careful about those things. There may be reasons to do multiple points of view and different timelines. So, for example, at one point I was considering a two point of view story, and each one starts at a different point in the narrative, and they sort of meet in the middle. And I was like, okay, cool, that sounds like a great idea, but it also sounds like I'm going to confuse a bunch of people, and only towards the end will they get what happened, and they'll be mad at me because I didn't tell them from the beginning. So you can do that, but there's no substitute for reading it yourself and trying to figure out, did this work? That's where experimentalism comes from. I encourage experimentalism as long as it's intentional.
And again, always think about your audience, because one person's audience is going to be different from someone else's audience as well. Yeah, I'm also getting a lot of great short story collection recommendation. Vincent
Oh,
Lam's
great.
short story collection, I think, was linked. There was Kim Fu's Lesser Known Monsters of the 21st Century, Chrysalis by Anuja
That's a great one.
Varghese,
Yeah. This is
The Pump by Sydney Hegel, as well as a bunch of others that I can't get through.
Yeah,
But I have,
I will say I have never done well when people ask me, "Hey, what's the book you recommend?" I've simply never done well, and then I go
it's
home,
okay.
like, here's a whole list. So
The
yeah.
chat has got us covered. We're good. I actually have a question for you. What is something you want to impart on us that you didn't get a chance to get through for your presentation?
Something I want to impart on you. Yeah, I think my presentation, I started off saying that I didn't want to be prescriptive, and then I went ahead and prescribed a whole bunch of things. If anything, I will say is there's never anything wrong with trying stuff out. Particularly as a short story writer, you have the advantage of your failed experiments not having cost you very much. If you work for 10 hours and at the end of the 10 hours you figure out that your narrative doesn't work, all you did was waste 10 hours, and you've wasted 10 hours on worse things before in your life. So that's okay. And now you know, and now you can move on to the next thing. So I think my title story in my collection, her first Palestinian, I wrote 30 pages doing something different with it before I figured out that no, that wasn't how I wanted to do. Scrapped all of them and started again. Don't be afraid of that. Be experimental.
Especially with the short story form, you have so much.
Yeah.
Like I find the novel can be a bit scary to approach because it's such a long form piece of work.
Mhm.
But with the short story, there's so much space to play
100%.
with.
Yeah.
Let's see if I can squeeze in one more
And I see
question.
Farzana has said that she hates wasting 10 hours. I also hate wasting 10 hours too. But I just think that this is the wrong way to think about it. I think like first of all, I shouldn't use the word waste because if you found out something, if you discovered something at the end of 10 hours, it wasn't a waste. It was productive. And worst case scenario, you practiced, right? So
Exactly. Practice makes perfect, or at the very least makes better.
yeah,
Um,
I was on a panel recently with Omar Al-Akkad, and he said that for one of his books, he wrote something like 65,000 words that he ended up junking. And I was like, well, I don't feel so bad about my 10,000 words then. So
we've actually have come to the end Again, it's always it's a great sign of a workshop if it feels like it's ended too soon. But I really appreciate you being here with us, Saeed, and just sharing your wisdom about short stories. And I really hope that this gave our audience members, whether they're watching live or through the rewatch, a chance to take this as a starting point and go off with their short stories, because it would be great to see even more out there in the world.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
No worries. All right. So we are going to do a bit of outros, and share some information with all of you. So first off, thank you so much for joining us for the webinar today. If you'd like to rewatch the webinar, the recording will be made available next week on YouTube. You will receive an email with the link to the video when it is ready. And we have a short attendee survey that will only take you 3 minutes to complete, which will also be sent along with that email. But essentially, we just want to get a sense of what's working, what's not working, any suggestions for future webinars as part of our free Fold Academy survey. So definitely fill that out if you wanted to give us some feedback. And of course, and the next Fold Academy workshop will be held in January 2024. So definitely follow us on social media or sign up for our e-news to get the announcement. And lastly, we are committed to keeping Fold Academy free for all writers. And to do so, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. If you find value in our monthly Fold Academy workshops, please consider supporting us with a monthly donation or one-time donation. So by visiting thefoldcanada.org/donate for the various donation options. But yes, once again, thank you so much for being here and have a lovely rest of your day. Bye.